The time was 6:11 p.m. in Washington, D.C. on May 14, 1948, and in the most powerful nation on earth, a president sat alone with a decision that had torn his administration in two. Just moments earlier, halfway across the world in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion had banged his gavel and declared the establishment of the State of Israel, the first Jewish sovereign nation in nearly 2,000 years. Now, the United States of America had to respond. And for Harry Truman, the man who had unexpectedly inherited the presidency just 3 years earlier, this was the culmination of the most intense political battle of his administration, a battle not fought with foreign adversaries, but within the very walls of the White House. The statement was simple, just 2 sentences, but its implications would echo through generations. This government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine, and recognition has been requested by the provisional government thereof. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel. In those 11 minutes between declaration and recognition, Truman had defied his own Secretary of State, ignored the near-unanimous advice of his foreign policy experts, and set America on a new course in the Middle East. But to understand this remarkable decision, we must journey back through the years of war and Holocaust, back through the growing Zionist movement, back to the personal relationships and political calculations that would lead an ordinary man from Missouri to make an extraordinary decision that his cabinet would never forget, nor forgive. The story truly begins not in 1948, but in the ashes of World War II, as the horrific scale of the Nazi genocide against the Jewish people became undeniably clear. 6 million Jews had been systematically murdered, and hundreds of thousands of survivors now languished in displaced persons camps across Europe, with nowhere to go, no home to return to. For many of these survivors, and for Jews around the world, the ancient dream of return to Zion, to their ancestral homeland in Palestine, took on new urgency and moral weight. As early as 1943, then-Senator Harry Truman had stood before a massive crowd at Chicago Stadium and revealed his own growing consciousness of this humanitarian catastrophe, declaring in a speech that was remarkably progressive for its time, "Today, not tomorrow, we must do all that is humanly possible to provide a haven and place of safety for all those who can be grasped from the hands of the Nazi butchers. Free lands must be opened to them. This is not a Jewish problem. It is an American problem, and we must and we will face it squarely and honorably." These were powerful words, but they came from a man who still occupied the relative political sidelines. Within a year, Truman would find himself unexpectedly thrust into the presidency following Franklin D. Roosevelt's death in April 1945, and the problem of Palestine would land squarely on his desk. The geopolitical landscape he inherited was complex and fraught with tension. Palestine was then under British administration, a mandate granted by the League of Nations after World War I, which had also produced the Balfour Declaration of 1917, a British statement supporting the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. But Arab opposition to Jewish immigration had been growing for decades, and the British, weary from war and facing increasing violence in Palestine, were preparing to withdraw and hand the problem over to the United Nations. To understand Truman's personal journey toward recognition, we must first understand the man himself. Harry Truman was a product of the American heartland, a Baptist from Missouri who had read the Bible cover to cover as a teenager and was deeply familiar with the stories of ancient Israel. He wasn't an intellectual, but he was a voracious reader of history, and he understood the Jewish connection to the land of Palestine in both historical and biblical terms. As he would later reflect, "I had faith in Israel even before it was established. I knew it was based on the love of freedom, which has been the guiding star of the Jewish people since the days of Moses." But Truman's connection to Jewish issues wasn't purely abstract or historical. It was also personal and practical. During World War I, as a young captain stationed at Camp Doniphan in Oklahoma, Truman had met a young Jewish soldier named Eddie Jacobson, and the two had formed an immediate bond. Together, they ran a highly successful canteen that provided their fellow soldiers with better food and supplies, with Truman later writing to his fiancée Bess Wallace, "I have a Jew in charge of the canteen by the name of Jacobson, and he is a crackerjack." After the war, this military friendship turned into a business partnership when Truman and Jacobson opened a haberdashery together in Kansas City, a venture that began with great hope but ultimately failed in the economic downturn of 1921, leaving both men deeply in debt. Though their business failed, their friendship endured through the years, surviving Truman's ascent to the Senate, the vice presidency, and ultimately the White House. It was this friendship, forged in the trenches of war and tested in the struggles of business, that would later prove crucial at a critical moment in the battle for recognition. As president, Truman found himself pulled in competing directions almost immediately. On one side were the Zionists, led by the distinguished scientist and statesman Chaim Weizmann, who argued passionately for a Jewish state as both a moral imperative after the Holocaust and the fulfillment of a historical right. On another side were the leaders of Arab nations, who saw the influx of Jewish immigrants to Palestine as a colonial incursion into Arab land. And then there was Truman's own government, the experts and diplomats at the State Department, who viewed the Palestine question primarily through the lens of Cold War realpolitik. Their concerns were starkly practical. They believed that supporting a Jewish state would alienate the Arab world, threaten American access to Middle Eastern oil, and potentially open the door to Soviet influence in the region. As Loy Henderson, the director of Near Eastern and African Affairs at the State Department, warned after meeting with Iraqi officials in the mid-1940s, if the United States should decide to take a firm stand in establishing a Zionist state in Palestine, the whole Arab world would begin to feel that the United States had become an enemy of the Arabs. This view was shared at the highest levels of the administration, including by Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, who famously told a House committee that oil was the lifeblood of a war machine, and that Arab response to partition would make pipelines to the Persian Gulf less secure. Forrestal even went so far as to telephone the Under-Secretary of State to suggest that Truman should not see any more of these Jews. Caught between these powerful forces, Truman often seemed conflicted and uncertain. In private, he could express deep sympathy for the Jewish plight, but he also grew increasingly frustrated with what he saw as the pressure tactics of some Zionist leaders. After one particularly contentious meeting, he wrote in his diary on July 21, 1947, "The Jews have no sense of proportion, nor do they have any judgment on world affairs. The Jews, I find, are very, very selfish. They care not how many Estonians, Latvians, Finns, Poles, Yugoslavs or Greeks get murdered or mistreated as displaced persons, as long as the Jews get special treatment." These words, which bear striking similarity to what a 2022 Anti-Defamation League survey found that 21% of Americans still believe, that Jews don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind, reveal the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of Truman's attitudes. The internal administration battle over Israel came to a head in 1947 as the British Mandate approached its end. The United Nations had proposed a partition plan that would divide Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, and after intense lobbying, including from the Truman administration itself, the plan passed the UN General Assembly on November 29, 1947. Jewish leaders accepted the partition, though many had hoped for more territory. Arab leaders rejected it outright. As the May 15, 1948, end of the British Mandate approached, the question became what the United States would do when the Jewish leadership declared their state. Within the Truman administration, two clear factions emerged. On one side stood virtually the entire foreign policy establishment. Secretary of State George Marshall, the revered war hero, his deputy Robert Lovett, Defense Secretary James Forrestal, and the State Department's regional experts like Loy Henderson. They argued passionately against recognition, believing it would destabilize the region and harm American interests. Marshall in particular was adamant, warning that recognition would undermine American credibility and align the United States with what he viewed as a potentially non-viable state that would likely be invaded by its Arab neighbors the moment it was declared. On the other side stood Truman's White House advisors, led by the shrewd and politically savvy Clark Clifford, who argued that recognition was both morally right and politically smart. Clifford understood the importance of Jewish voters in the upcoming 1948 election, but he also genuinely believed in the justice of a Jewish homeland. He countered the State Department's arguments point by point, writing in a memorandum that their concerns were completely fallacious, and that there must be no shilly-shallying appeasement of the Arabs. The tension between these two camps grew increasingly bitter as the May deadline approached, with each man believing he had the best interests of the United States at heart, yet reaching diametrically opposed conclusions. The most dramatic confrontation occurred on May 12, 1948, just 2 days before the British Mandate was set to expire. Truman convened a meeting in the Oval Office that would become legendary in the annals of American diplomatic history. On one side sat George Marshall, the respected statesman whose integrity was unquestioned, the architect of victory in World War II, and now the namesake of the Marshall Plan that was rebuilding Europe. On the other side sat Clark Clifford, representing the political and moral arguments for immediate recognition. The atmosphere was tense as Clifford made his case, arguing that the United States should recognize the Jewish state immediately upon its declaration. Marshall was visibly angered by what he saw as a politicization of foreign policy. The usually diplomatic general spoke bluntly, telling Truman that if he followed Clifford's advice, it would be purely for domestic political reasons, and that if he were to vote in the election, he would vote against the president. This was an astonishing statement, the Secretary of State essentially threatening to oppose his own president in an election. The meeting ended without clear resolution, leaving Truman torn between his deep respect for Marshall and his growing conviction that recognition was the right course. Later, Marshall would write of this meeting, "I said bluntly that if the president were to follow Mr. Clifford's advice, and if in the elections I were to vote, I would vote against the president." The breach was as deep as any in modern American administration, and Truman faced an impossible choice: side with his revered Secretary of State and risk the collapse of the Jewish state before it even began, or side with his political advisors and create a potentially irreparable rift with the foreign policy establishment. While these high-level debates raged within the administration, a more personal drama was unfolding, one that would prove decisive in Truman's thinking. Throughout the spring of 1948, Truman had been refusing to meet with Chaim Weizmann, the elder statesman of the Zionist movement who had traveled to America hoping for a final audience with the president. Truman was frustrated with what he saw as the incessant pressure from Zionist lobbyists, and he had grown resistant to meeting with any more Jewish leaders. It was at this critical juncture that Eddie Jacobson, Truman's old friend and business partner, entered the story. Jacobson, who had never before asked Truman for any political favor, flew to Washington without an appointment and appeared at the White House. Admitted to the Oval Office, the two friends spoke privately, and Jacobson made an emotional plea for Truman to see Weizmann. Truman initially resisted, his face hardening as he complained about how disrespectful and mean certain Jewish leaders had been to him. But Jacobson persisted, comparing Weizmann to Truman's own hero, Andrew Jackson, and telling his old friend, "I thought you could take this one of the great men of our time." This personal appeal from someone Truman trusted completely, someone with no political agenda beyond his heartfelt belief in the cause, finally broke through Truman's resistance. He agreed to meet secretly with Weizmann, and that meeting, held on March 18, 1948, profoundly affected Truman's perspective. Weizmann, a distinguished scientist and diplomat, presented the case for Jewish statehood with dignity and persuasiveness, and Truman came away impressed. Though he still couldn't promise official recognition, he told Weizmann, "You can bank on us." This personal intervention, facilitated by Jacobson's friendship, had shifted the momentum at a crucial moment. As the clock ticked down toward the end of the British Mandate on May 14, pressure intensified on all sides. The State Department continued to argue for delay and caution, while Clifford and the White House team pushed for immediate recognition. The geopolitical considerations were complex. The Soviet Union had surprisingly supported the partition plan at the UN, and there was genuine concern in Washington that if America didn't act quickly, the Soviets might recognize Israel first, gaining a foothold in the Middle East at American expense. Indeed, just 3 days after Truman's recognition, the Soviet Union would extend its own de jure recognition, becoming the first country to grant full legal recognition to the Jewish state. On the morning of May 14, as David Ben-Gurion and the Jewish leadership in Tel Aviv prepared to declare the State of Israel at 6 p.m. local time, which would be 12 p.m. Eastern Time in Washington, Truman still hadn't made a final decision. Clifford was urging immediate recognition, while Marshall and Lovett continued to oppose it. In fact, Lovett would later call Clifford's push for recognition a transparent attempt to win the Jewish vote that was weaving a web of shame. The decision came down to the final hours. At approximately 4 p.m. Washington time, just 2 hours before the declaration in Tel Aviv, Truman made his choice. He would recognize Israel. The statement was prepared, and Truman even made last-minute handwritten changes to the text. The White House then waited, wanting the recognition to come after the declaration, not before. At 6 p.m. in Tel Aviv, Ben-Gurion banged his gavel and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. 11 minutes later, at 6:11 p.m. Washington time, the White House released Truman's statement. The United States had become the first nation to recognize the Jewish state. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. In Tel Aviv, where people had been celebrating the declaration, the news of American recognition triggered even greater euphoria. The New York Times reported from the scene, "There was great cheering and drinking of toasts in this blacked-out city when word was received that the United States had recognized the provincial government." The effect on the people, especially those drinking late in Tel Aviv's coffeehouses, was electric. They even ran into the blackness of the streets shouting, cheering, and toasting the United States. For Jews in the nascent nation, facing the imminent invasion of 5 Arab armies, American recognition was not just a diplomatic formality, it was a psychological lifeline, a signal that they would not stand alone. Back in Washington, the reaction within Truman's administration was considerably less celebratory. The State Department professionals were stunned and angered. They felt blindsided. Many had learned of the recognition from news reports rather than through official channels. Secretary Marshall, though he had promised Truman he would not publicly oppose the decision, remained deeply opposed in private. The breach between the White House and the State Department would take years to heal, if it ever truly did. The professional diplomats believed that Truman had allowed domestic politics to override sound foreign policy, and they worried about the long-term consequences for American interests in the Middle East. Their concerns were not entirely unfounded. In the immediate aftermath of recognition, Arab leaders made good on their warnings, and the United States did indeed face backlash across the Arab world. American access to Middle Eastern oil was temporarily threatened, and U.S. relations with Arab nations would remain strained for years. Meanwhile, just as Marshall had predicted, within hours of the declaration, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded Israel, beginning the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the fledgling Israeli state would ultimately prevail, but the conflict set in motion a struggle that would continue for decades. Truman himself maintained that his decision was based not on politics but on principle. He later stated that his policy in Palestine was not an Arab policy or a Jewish policy, but an American policy, because it was based on the desire to see promises kept and human misery relieved. In the years that followed, the relationship between the United States and Israel would evolve in ways Truman might not have anticipated. Though he had recognized Israel, Truman maintained an arms embargo during the 1948 war, refusing to send weapons to either side. It was actually the Soviet Union, through its satellite state Czechoslovakia, that provided crucial arms to Israel in those early days, a historical irony given Israel's eventual alignment with the West. The special relationship between America and Israel that we know today developed gradually over subsequent administrations, with President John F. Kennedy first using the term special relationship, and President Lyndon Johnson significantly deepening the military and diplomatic ties. But it was Truman who laid the foundation, Truman who made the first courageous, controversial decision to extend recognition at that critical moment. The legacy of Truman's decision is complex and continues to be debated by historians. Some view it as a moral triumph, a necessary response to the Holocaust and the centuries of persecution that preceded it. Others see it as a strategic blunder that created decades of instability in the Middle East. What's undeniable is that those 11 minutes between declaration and recognition represent one of the most dramatic moments in 20th century diplomacy. Truman, the ordinary man from Missouri who never expected to be president, had made an extraordinary decision. He had gone against the advice of the experts, against the warnings of his most respected advisor, and followed his own moral and political compass. The factors behind his decision were as complex as the man himself, part political calculation, part moral conviction, part personal relationship, and part historical vision. The Baptist from Missouri who knew his Bible, the friend who trusted Eddie Jacobson, the politician who needed Jewish votes in a tough election, the humanitarian who wanted to relieve suffering, all these Harry Trumans coexisted in the decision he made that day. Years later, when Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion reflected on Truman's role, he said, "As a foreigner I could not judge what would be his place in American history, but his helpfulness to us, his constant sympathy with our aims in Israel, his courageous decision to recognize our state so quickly and his steadfast support since then has given him an immortal place in Jewish history." And perhaps Lyndon Johnson best captured why Truman's decision resonated so deeply with Americans when he observed that the American people voted for and loved Harry Truman not because he gave them hell but because he gave them hope. It is no coincidence that the anthem of the newborn ancient nation is the hope, Ha-Tikva. In the end, the story of Truman's recognition of Israel is a story about the power of a single decision to change history, about the conflict between expertise and intuition, between realpolitik and moral vision. It's a story that reminds us that even in an age of bureaucratic machinery and institutional processes, individuals still matter, their convictions still shape events, and their courage, or their caution, still echoes through time. The 11 minutes that passed between the birth of a nation and its recognition by the world's greatest power stand as a testament to the enduring truth that history is not just made by vast, impersonal forces, but by human beings, in all their complexity, their contradiction, and their capacity for both wisdom and error. And for better or worse, those 11 minutes made our world what it is today.